There are people who seem to experience ordinary life differently. They notice the contradiction nobody else noticed. They become obsessed with a question everyone else considers pointless. They can listen to a simple explanation and immediately think, but why? And sometimes, they replay an ordinary conversation hours later, not because they're insecure, but because their mind is still trying to understand what actually happened. The strange part? They may not even think they're intelligent. They simply feel different. Maybe you've wondered why your mind refuses to switch off. Why simple things sometimes become surprisingly complicated. Why you can become completely absorbed in subjects nobody around you seems interested in. Or why being surrounded by people can still leave you feeling mentally alone. If any of that sounds familiar, pay attention. Because psychologists don't define intelligence simply as knowing more facts. Cognitive ability involves things like reasoning, recognizing relationships, adapting to unfamiliar situations, solving problems, and processing complex information. And when a person naturally seeks complexity and deeper understanding, certain habits can emerge. Not every person with these habits has a high IQ. And having a high IQ doesn't mean you'll have all of them. But when several appear together, they can reveal something fascinating about the way a person's mind approaches reality. And the seventh habit may be the one that connects everything. Sign 1. They keep asking why after everyone else has stopped. Most people are satisfied when they receive an answer that works. A highly curious mind often isn't. Someone explains why something happened, and instead of thinking, okay, that makes sense, you think, but why does that explanation work? Then another question appears. And another. Suddenly, you're no longer interested in the original answer. You're trying to understand the entire system underneath it. This is one reason intellectually curious people can disappear down extraordinary rabbit holes. A random question becomes a search. The search produces another question. That question reveals another gap in your understanding. And suddenly an hour has disappeared. You might start researching how airplanes stay in the air and somehow end up reading about fluid dynamics, turbulence, wing design, and the history of aviation. Nobody asked you to. There was simply something you didn't understand, and your mind didn't like leaving the gap open. This is related to intellectual curiosity, the tendency to seek information, complexity, and understanding beyond what is immediately necessary. But here's the important part. The intelligence isn't necessarily in asking more questions. It's in recognizing which questions are worth asking. And that leads to something even more unusual. Because a mind that questions the world eventually learns to question itself. Sign 2. They can change their mind when the evidence changes. This sounds simple, but psychologically, it's difficult. Once people become attached to an opinion, changing it can feel like admitting defeat. Your beliefs become connected to your identity. So when someone challenges the belief, it can feel as though they're challenging you. But intellectually flexible people can eventually learn to separate their ego from their conclusions. They can say, I used to think that. Then I learned something I didn't know. And now I think differently. That isn't weakness. It's updating. Imagine your understanding of reality as a mental map. If new information shows that part of the map is wrong, you have two choices. You can defend the old map, or you can redraw it. The second option can be uncomfortable, but it gets you closer to reality. And this is one of the most important distinctions between intelligence and simply appearing intelligent. Someone who needs to always be right is protecting an identity. Someone who cares more about being accurate than being right is protecting the truth. But there's a surprising consequence to thinking this way. The more comfortable you become with your own mind, the less stimulation you sometimes need from other people. Which brings us to the third habit. Sign 3. They genuinely enjoy solitude. Some people become uncomfortable when they're alone. Others finally become comfortable. There's an important difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the feeling that you want meaningful connection but don't have it. Solitude is choosing space because your mind needs room. For some highly reflective people, being alone isn't an absence of stimulation. It's the opposite. It's freedom from interruption. No notifications. No expectations. No need to perform. No conversation competing with your thoughts. Just mental space. And that's often when ideas begin connecting. You might suddenly understand something while walking alone. You might solve a problem in the shower. You might have your clearest thoughts late at night when everyone else is asleep. This doesn't mean people who enjoy solitude are automatically intelligent. Personality matters enormously. But for someone whose mind is constantly processing information, solitude can become a valuable environment for reflection. And there's another reason some people seek it. They aren't necessarily trying to escape people. Sometimes they're trying to escape surface-level interaction, because their next habit can make ordinary conversations surprisingly exhausting. Sign 4. They get bored by conversations that never go deeper. Small talk isn't bad. It's actually useful. It's how people establish familiarity, comfort, and social connection. But some people become unusually hungry for depth. They don't just want to know what someone does. They want to know why they chose it. They don't just want to know someone's opinion. They want to understand what experiences created it. They want to know what someone believes when nobody is watching. What changed them? What scares them? What they are becoming. And when conversations repeatedly stay at the surface, their attention begins to disappear. They might participate politely while internally thinking, "Is this really all we're talking about?" This can create a strange feeling of being socially present but mentally somewhere else. And it's easy to misinterpret. You might think, maybe I'm antisocial. Maybe something is wrong with me. But sometimes the problem isn't that you dislike people. You simply connect more strongly through ideas, meaning, curiosity, and depth. And once you become accustomed to looking beneath the surface, you may start doing it everywhere, including in situations where there may be nothing underneath. That's when the fifth habit becomes fascinating. Sign 5. They notice patterns other people completely miss. A person's behavior changes slightly. A story doesn't quite match something they said earlier. Two unrelated events suddenly seem connected. A tiny change in someone's tone makes you wonder whether something else is happening. Your mind starts connecting dots. Human brains are naturally built to detect patterns. But some people become particularly attentive to relationships between information. They don't just see individual events. They look for the structure connecting them. This can be incredibly useful. It's part of what allows people to recognize trends, solve problems, make predictions, and understand complex systems. But here's the trap. A pattern-seeking mind can also find patterns that aren't actually there. And this is where intelligence requires something more important than pattern recognition: skepticism. You might notice something nobody else noticed. That doesn't automatically mean your interpretation is correct. The mature response isn't, "I saw the pattern, therefore I'm right." It's, "I saw a pattern, now let's test it." That single distinction separates insight from assumption. And once you learn to question the patterns you see in the world, something even more interesting happens. You begin questioning the patterns inside yourself. Sign 6. They analyze their own thinking. After a conversation, you might replay it. Not necessarily because you're worried. Sometimes you're investigating yourself. Why did I react that way? Why did that comment bother me? Was I actually angry? Or was I embarrassed? Did I misunderstand the situation? Why did I make that decision? Could I have handled it differently? This is closely related to metacognition, thinking about your own thinking. Most people experience a thought and immediately react to it. Metacognition creates another layer. You experience the thought and then observe it. You feel anger and ask where it came from. You notice anxiety and become curious about the story your mind is creating around it. Instead of saying, "I am this way," you begin asking, "Why does my mind keep doing this?" That shift is incredibly powerful. because you start realizing that not every thought deserves obedience. A thought is information, not necessarily truth, and that realization leads to the seventh habit. Because once you understand how unreliable your own mind can sometimes be, you become surprisingly comfortable with something most people desperately avoid: uncertainty. Sign 7, they can say, "I don't know." 3 simple words: I don't know. For many people, uncertainty creates discomfort. We want an answer. We want closure. We want to know who's right. But intellectually mature people can sometimes tolerate uncertainty without immediately filling the gap with a convenient conclusion. They can sit inside a question. They can investigate. They can wait. And that is much harder than it sounds. Because saying "I don't know" can feel like admitting weakness, but it can actually be the beginning of learning. Think about it. If you believe you already know everything, what reason do you have to investigate? But if you can admit that your understanding is incomplete, curiosity has somewhere to go. And suddenly, all 7 habits begin connecting. The person who asks why is refusing to accept the first explanation. The person who changes their mind is willing to replace an outdated explanation. The person who enjoys solitude creates space to develop their own thoughts. The person who seeks deeper conversations wants to move beyond surface-level information. The person who notices patterns looks for relationships between ideas. The person who studies their own thinking examines the system generating those ideas. And the person who can say, "I don't know," recognizes the limits of the entire system. So perhaps the deeper trait isn't simply intelligence, it's something closer to intellectual independence. A refusal to automatically accept the first version of reality presented to you. But there's a warning here, because every cognitive strength has a shadow. Curiosity without discipline can become distraction. Analysis without emotional awareness can become overthinking. Pattern recognition without skepticism can become false certainty. Solitude without connection can become isolation. Independence without humility can become arrogance. And intelligence without self-awareness can become something surprisingly dangerous: the ability to construct extremely sophisticated reasons for your own mistakes. That's why the goal isn't to convince yourself that you're smarter than everyone else. The goal is to understand your mind well enough to use its strengths without becoming controlled by them. Maybe you don't need to stop asking questions. You need to learn which questions deserve your attention. Maybe you don't need to stop analyzing. You need to know when analysis has become rumination. Maybe you don't need to avoid solitude. You need to make sure solitude doesn't become disconnection. Maybe you don't need to trust every pattern you notice. You need to test it. And maybe you don't need to have every answer. You simply need to become comfortable searching for better ones. Because there's a deeper transformation that happens when you start understanding yourself this way. You stop asking, "Why can't I be normal?" and start asking, "What is my mind trying to teach me?" That is a completely different question. And perhaps that's why some people spend years feeling like something about them is wrong. They were measuring themselves against the wrong standard. They thought needing solitude meant they were antisocial. They thought asking too many questions meant they were difficult. They thought analyzing everything meant something was wrong with them. They thought changing their minds made them uncertain. They thought saying, "I don't know," made them less intelligent. But perhaps these behaviors weren't meant to become trophies. They were clues. Clues about how their mind naturally interacts with the world. And the real goal isn't to become someone who is constantly trying to prove they're intelligent. It's to become someone who understands their own cognitive strengths, recognizes their weaknesses, and knows when to trust each one. Because intelligence isn't simply about how much information you can store. It's about what you do with uncertainty, what you do with evidence, what you do with your own mistakes, what you do with your attention. And perhaps most importantly, what you do when you discover that your own mind might be wrong. So the next time you catch yourself questioning something everyone else accepts, or disappearing into a subject nobody else understands, or noticing a pattern that makes you stop and think, or replaying a conversation because you're trying to understand what really happened. Don't immediately judge yourself. Pause. Get curious. Ask yourself, what is my mind doing right now? Because the most unusual parts of your personality aren't necessarily problems waiting to be fixed. Some may simply be signals waiting to be understood. And perhaps the real mark of intelligence isn't having an answer faster than everyone else. Maybe it's being curious enough to question the answer you already have. So if you've recognized yourself in several of these habits, don't ask yourself whether that makes you smarter than everyone else. Ask something more useful. How can I use the way my mind works without letting it control me? Because maybe you were never supposed to become more like everyone else. Maybe you were supposed to understand yourself well enough that you no longer needed to. If one of these 7 habits felt strangely familiar, tell me which one in the comments. And if you want more videos exploring the psychology behind intelligence, personality, and the strange ways our minds work, subscribe to Psychology Theories.